The loneliest person in America was not the one who had nothing. It was the woman who had everything except someone who truly saw her. Every financial magazine called Victoria Sterling unstoppable. Every business network praised her fearless leadership. Every quarter, Sterling Global Holdings climbed higher while competitors struggled to keep pace. She owned skyscrapers that reflected the Manhattan skyline, traveled aboard private aircraft, and signed agreements worth hundreds of millions of dollars with the calm confidence of someone who had spent her entire life learning that emotions belonged outside the boardroom. Yet there was one headline she could never erase. 3 engagements, 3 broken promises, 3 men who walked away before saying, "I do." Some disappeared quietly. Others claimed they could never live beside a woman more successful than themselves. A few simply admitted the truth. They had fallen in love with her fortune long before they ever tried to understand her heart. America debated her story every day. Television hosts called her intimidating. Online commentators insisted that wealth had made genuine love impossible. Nobody stopped long enough to wonder whether success had become the very prison she never intended to build. On a cool October morning, sunlight spilled across the floor-to-ceiling windows of Sterling Global Headquarters, painting golden reflections across polished marble and glass. Around the enormous conference table, executives celebrated another record-breaking acquisition with enthusiastic applause. Victoria listened politely, signed the final documents, and accepted every congratulation with graceful professionalism. When the meeting ended, the room filled with laughter, handshakes, and ambitious conversations about the next opportunity. She quietly gathered her notes, thanked everyone for their dedication, and walked away before the celebration even began. The elevator descended in complete silence. Her reflection stared back from the mirrored walls, perfectly composed, elegantly dressed, and somehow more exhausted than ever. Outside, a black luxury sport utility vehicle waited beside the entrance. Her long-time driver stepped forward and opened the rear door. "Oh, Miss Sterling?" he asked. Victoria looked beyond the crowded streets where strangers hurried beneath towering buildings without ever noticing one another. She hesitated for several seconds before answering with unexpected softness. "Take me somewhere nobody knows my name." The driver nodded without another question. Hours later, concrete towers faded behind rolling hills. Busy highways narrowed into peaceful country roads, and the endless sound of traffic surrendered to rustling maple trees dressed in brilliant shades of crimson and gold. The crisp autumn air drifted through the slightly opened window, carrying the scent of cedar, fresh apples, and distant wood smoke. It had been years since Victoria remembered breathing without feeling rushed. Nearly 600 miles away, in the quiet town of Maple Creek, Ethan Brooks brushed a layer of fine sawdust from a handcrafted walnut dining table before stepping back to admire the careful work of his own hands. The modest woodworking shop had never made him wealthy, but had given him something money could never replace. Honest work, a peaceful home, and enough stability to raise his 8-year-old daughter, Lily, with kindness instead of fear. "Daddy," Lily called as she skipped into the workshop carrying a tiny wooden birdhouse she had painted with bright blue flowers. "Do you think every person eventually finds where they belong?" Ethan smiled gently before setting aside his carving tools. "Sometimes," he answered, "people spend years searching for the right place, only to discover they were really searching for the right person." Neither of them realized that somewhere beyond the winding roads leading toward Maple Creek, a woman the entire country believed had already won at life was quietly driving toward the only thing she had never been able to buy. Victoria checked into the only bed and breakfast in Maple Creek under the name Victoria Stone. The elderly owner handed her an old brass key attached to a carved maple leaf and smiled with the easy kindness that seemed to belong to everyone in town. "Breakfast starts at 7. Coffee is ready before sunrise. And if you need anything, just knock on my door," she said warmly. There were no curious questions, no whispered conversations, and no one asking for a photograph. Victoria carried her single overnight bag upstairs and paused beside the window overlooking the quiet main street. A bicycle leaned against the fence outside the bakery. Children chased bright autumn leaves across the sidewalk, while neighbors greeted one another by first name. The peaceful rhythm felt almost unfamiliar. The following morning, she dressed in a simple cream sweater, blue jeans, and comfortable leather boots before leaving her expensive watches and jewelry locked inside her suitcase. She wanted one ordinary day, even if it lasted only a few hours. The crisp October air carried the comforting scent of fresh cinnamon rolls, roasted coffee, and with smoke drifting from nearby chimneys. Every storefront seemed to tell its own story. The hardware store displayed handmade bird feeders. The bookstore placed pumpkins beside its front door. Fresh apples filled wooden baskets outside the local market. For the first time in years, Victoria walked without anyone watching her every step. As she wandered farther along Main Street, the steady sound of sandpaper brushing against wood drifted through the open doorway of a modest workshop. A weathered sign above the entrance read Brooks Woodcraft. Curiosity quietly pulled her inside. Sunlight poured through old windows, illuminating rows of handcrafted tables, rocking chairs, bookshelves, and children's toys made from polished walnut and oak. The scent of cedar filled the warm room. Ethan looked up from his workbench, brushed the sawdust from his hands, and offered a welcoming smile. "Good morning. Feel free to look around. Every piece has its own story." Victoria slowly traced her fingertips across the smooth surface of a handcrafted dining table. "Did you make all of these yourself?" she asked. Ethan nodded with quiet pride. "Most of them. Sometimes my best assistant helps." As if on cue, Lily skipped into the workshop carrying a tiny wooden birdhouse painted with blue flowers and bright yellow birds. "Daddy lets me pick the colors," she announced, happily before smiling at Victoria. "Hello, I am Lily." Victoria knelt beside her with a genuine smile that surprised even herself. "It is very nice to meet you, Lily. That is beautiful work." Lily studied Victoria's face with innocent honesty. "You look like you forgot how to smile, but I think it is coming back." Ethan laughed softly and shook his head. "She notices everything." Victoria laughed with them, a quiet sound that felt strangely unfamiliar after years of carefully measured conversations. Ethan walked toward a small counter and poured a steaming cup of fresh apple cider into a ceramic mug before handing it to her. "We make too much every morning," he said. "Please enjoy it." Victoria accepted the warm mug with both hands. "You do not even know who I am." Ethan smiled without hesitation. "Around here, we usually learn someone's character before we learn their story." Those simple words settled gently inside her heart. They carried no admiration for wealth, no hidden expectations, and no curiosity about success. They were simply honest. Standing inside that modest woodworking shop surrounded by handcrafted furniture and quiet dignity, Victoria felt something she had not experienced in years. For the first time in a very long time, she felt completely invisible, and somehow that made her feel truly seen. Over the next several days, Victoria discovered that Maple Creek followed a rhythm completely different from the world she had left behind. Nobody seemed to measure life by quarterly reports or packed calendars. The bakery owner paused every morning to ask neighbors about their families. The mail carrier greeted every child by name. Even the old clock above the town square seemed to move more gently, as though time itself respected the peaceful pace of the little community. Without planning to, Victoria found herself returning to Brooks Woodcraft almost every afternoon. Sometimes she admired a newly finished bookshelf or watched Ethan carefully restore an antique rocking chair whose polished wood carried stories older than either of them. Other days, she simply accepted another warm mug of fresh apple cider, while Lily happily described everything that had happened at school, from spelling quizzes to the bluebird she hoped would finally choose her painted birdhouse for a home. One bright Saturday morning, Lily looked up with hopeful eyes. "Miss Victoria, would you like to come with us to Miller Pond? The ducks always get excited when Daddy brings extra birdseed." Ethan smiled apologetically. "You do not have to if you already have plans." Victoria looked toward the clear blue sky stretching above the maple trees before quietly answering, "I think this might be the best plan I have had in a very long time." The three of them walked beneath rows of brilliant red and golden trees, while crisp leaves crunched beneath their boots. The cool breeze carried the scent of cedar, fresh water, and distant chimney smoke. At the pond, Lily laughed every time another duck hurried across the water toward the shore, scattering birdseed with endless excitement. Ethan watched his daughter with the peaceful expression of a father who understood that happiness often arrived disguised as ordinary moments. Victoria noticed how completely present he remained. He never glanced at a phone. He never rushed a conversation. When Lily spoke, she received his full attention, as though nothing in the world could possibly be more important. That simple habit impressed Victoria more than any executive presentation she had ever witnessed. "Your shop seems successful," she said as they sat together on an old wooden bench overlooking the water. Ethan smiled thoughtfully. "It keeps the lights on, pays the bills, and lets me be home when Lily gets out of school. I would call that a pretty good life." Victoria lowered her eyes toward the calm reflections dancing across the pond. She had spent years listening to people define success with numbers that stretched into the millions. Yet somehow this quiet craftsman measured success with evenings at home, shared dinners, and enough time to watch his daughter grow. Lily suddenly bent down and picked up a small heart-shaped stone from the shoreline. "Daddy says cracked things can still become beautiful if somebody keeps taking care of them," she said proudly as she placed the smooth stone into Victoria's hand. Victoria wrapped her fingers gently around it, feeling unexpected emotion rise inside her chest. Ethan looked toward the water with a soft smile. Her mother used to believe that too. The breeze stirred the colorful leaves overhead, while a flock of geese crossed the bright autumn sky. None of them spoke for several peaceful moments, yet the silence felt comforting instead of empty. As they walked back toward town beneath the warm afternoon sunlight, Victoria realized she had not thought about stock markets, board meetings, or business headlines once during the entire day. Instead, she found herself wondering whether a life filled with simple kindness, honest work, and people who cared without asking for anything in return might have been the greatest success she had been searching for all along. The following week unfolded with the quiet certainty of autumn settling over Maple Creek. Each morning began with the gentle ringing of the church bell, the comforting aroma of fresh coffee drifting from the bakery, and the sight of golden leaves gathering along the sidewalks before shop owners swept them away with friendly conversation instead of hurried silence. Victoria no longer felt like a visitor passing through. She had become part of the town's peaceful rhythm without anyone asking about her past. She helped the librarian organize a shelf of donated children's books, bought fresh apples from the family market every Tuesday, and spent nearly every afternoon stopping by Brooks Woodcraft, where Ethan always greeted her with the same warm smile he had offered on the very first day. He never treated her differently because he still believed she was simply Victoria's Stone, a thoughtful woman looking for a little peace. One Saturday, Ethan delivered a handcrafted walnut dining table to an elderly retired schoolteacher who lived a few miles outside town. Lily insisted that Victoria come along. The old pickup truck rolled slowly through winding country roads bordered by brilliant maple trees, white fences, and open fields stretching toward the horizon beneath a sky so clear it almost seemed endless. When they reached the farmhouse, the retired teacher welcomed them with homemade biscuits, blackberry preserves, and fresh sweet tea, served on a weathered wooden porch overlooking rolling hills. After Ethan carefully positioned the dining table inside her home, the grateful woman quietly slipped an envelope toward him. Ethan gently smiled and pushed it back across the table. "We already agreed on the price," he said kindly. "You should keep the rest." The woman looked at him with affectionate admiration. "That is why this whole county trusts you. You always leave people feeling richer than when you arrived." Victoria watched the exchange without speaking. She had negotiated contracts worth hundreds of millions of dollars, yet she had never witnessed generosity offered with such natural ease. Nothing about Ethan suggested he expected recognition. Kindness simply seemed to be part of who he was. On the drive back to town, Lily suddenly pointed toward colorful banners hanging across Main Street. "Daddy, today is the Harvest Festival. Ethan laughed softly. I suppose our afternoon plans just changed. Music floated through the crisp autumn air as local families gathered around handmade craft booths, pumpkin displays, fresh pies, and children playing old-fashioned carnival games. Volunteers greeted every guest with genuine smiles while the scent of cinnamon, roasted pecans, caramel apples, and kettle corn drifted through the lively square. Victoria had attended elegant charity galas inside grand hotels, yet none of them felt as joyful as this simple community celebration. Lily entered a pumpkin decorating contest and insisted both adults participate. Ethan carved a cheerful, smiling face into his pumpkin, while Victoria quietly painted a tiny wooden cottage surrounded by maple trees beneath a bright evening sky. Lily studied the finished painting and smiled. That looks like a place where people never have to pretend. Victoria paused before answering. Maybe that is exactly why I painted it. Ethan glanced at her with quiet understanding, but asked no questions. As sunset painted the town in warm shades of amber and gold, strings of lights glowed above the square, while neighbors gathered beneath the gazebo to enjoy live bluegrass music. Victoria stood beside Ethan, watching Lily dance happily with several local children, her carefree laughter echoing across the evening air. You know, Victoria whispered after a long, peaceful silence, I spent years believing success meant building something bigger every year. Ethan folded his hands comfortably into his jacket pockets and smiled toward his daughter. Sometimes the strongest life is not the biggest one. Sometimes it is simply the one that leaves room for the people you love. Victoria looked toward the glowing lights reflecting in Ethan's calm eyes, unaware that far beyond the peaceful streets of Maple Creek, the world she had quietly left behind had finally begun searching for the woman who had suddenly disappeared. Monday morning arrived wrapped in a blanket of cool autumn fog that slowly lifted as sunlight spread across the rooftops of Maple Creek. Victoria sat alone on the front porch of the bed and breakfast with a steaming cup of coffee resting between her hands. For nearly 2 peaceful weeks, she had ignored the world beyond the little town. Her phone had remained switched off inside the nightstand drawer, untouched except to check the time. It had been the longest stretch of silence she had allowed herself in years, and somewhere deep inside, she secretly wished it could last forever. As she finished the last sip of coffee, curiosity finally persuaded her to unlock the phone. The screen instantly filled with hundreds of missed calls, dozens of urgent messages, and countless emails marked with bright red priority symbols. Board members were requesting immediate decisions. Attorneys needed signatures. Financial analysts warned about market uncertainty. Her executive assistant had left a final message only 30 minutes earlier. Ms. Sterling, we have respected your privacy for as long as possible, but the board cannot postpone the emergency meeting any longer. Please contact us as soon as you receive this. Victoria slowly closed her eyes. The peaceful life she had borrowed was beginning to slip away. That afternoon, she walked toward Brooks Woodcraft carrying a small paper bag filled with fresh cinnamon rolls from the bakery, hoping to enjoy one more ordinary conversation before making the difficult call back to New York. As she approached the workshop, the quiet atmosphere of Maple Creek suddenly changed. 3 sleek black sport utility vehicles turned on a Main Street one after another, their polished surfaces reflecting the brilliant autumn leaves like dark mirrors. They stopped beside the town square, drawing curious glances from neighbors who rarely saw expensive vehicles in their peaceful community. Several professionally dressed executives stepped out, followed by discreet members of her corporate security team. They looked around for only a few moments before one of them recognized her immediately. Ms. Sterling, the senior executive called respectfully as he walked toward her. We have finally found you. Conversations throughout the square gradually faded into silence. Shop owners paused in their doorways. Customers looked up from their coffee. Ethan had just carried a handcrafted bookshelf onto the front porch of his workshop when he noticed the unusual gathering across the street. Lily gently tugged on his sleeve. Daddy, why are those people calling Miss Victoria by another name? Ethan looked toward Victoria without answering. The executive stopped a respectful distance away. The board meeting has been rescheduled twice. International investors are waiting. The merger cannot move forward without your approval. Your aircraft is standing by at the regional airport. Victoria lowered her eyes before quietly replying, "Please tell them I need a little more time." The executive nodded with understanding, but concern remained written across his face. As the security team stepped back, one of the younger employees quietly glanced at a financial news article displayed on his tablet. The photograph on the screen matched the woman standing in the middle of Maple Creek. Within minutes, whispers traveled gently through the crowd like autumn leaves carried by the wind. Victoria Stone was not simply a traveler seeking peace. She was Victoria Sterling, one of the most successful business leaders in America. Ethan stood silently outside his workshop, watching the woman he had welcomed without questions. She looked exactly the same as she had the day she first walked through his door. The only thing that had changed was the story surrounding her. Victoria slowly crossed the street until she stood in front of him. "I wanted you to know before someone else told you," she whispered. Ethan offered a quiet smile filled with kindness instead of surprise. "I suppose that explains why you always look like you were carrying the weight of an entire city." She smiled sadly. "Does it change anything?" Ethan glanced toward the waiting luxury vehicles before looking back in her eyes. "It should not," he answered softly, "but I am afraid the world you belong to may believe otherwise." Those words settled gently between them as the autumn breeze carried another shower of golden leaves across the quiet street. And for the first time since arriving in Maple Creek, Victoria felt the peaceful life she had begun to love slipping slowly beyond her reach. That evening, the familiar peace of Maple Creek felt strangely fragile. The maple trees still glowed beneath the fading sunlight. The bakery still filled the air with the comforting scent of fresh bread, and neighbors still waved to one another as they walked home from work. Yet Victoria sensed that the quiet refuge she had discovered was slowly slipping away. She remained on the porch of the bed and breakfast long after darkness settled across the little town, watching the warm lights inside Brooke's woodcraft glowing softly in the distance. Every instinct told her she needed to return to New York before her responsibilities began affecting thousands of employees who depended on her leadership. Yet every beat of her heart whispered that leaving Maple Creek meant leaving behind the first place where she had ever felt loved simply for being herself. Across town, Ethan carefully swept the last traces of sawdust from the workshop floor before placing every tool back into its familiar place. He had always believed that putting things in order helped clear the mind, but tonight the quiet routine brought no answers. Lily sat at the workbench, painting another tiny wooden birdhouse while occasionally glancing toward her father. Finally, she set down her paintbrush and asked the question she had been holding inside all evening. "Daddy, is Miss Victoria really one of the richest people in America?" Ethan smiled gently. "That is what everyone seems to believe." Lily looked thoughtfully at the colorful birdhouse in front of her. "She still laughed when I spilled birdseed at the pond. She still thanked Mrs. Dawson for the apple pie. She still liked your apple cider." Ethan nodded. "Yes, she did." Lily tilted her head with quiet curiosity. "Then why does everybody think she is different now?" Ethan looked through the workshop window toward the peaceful street outside before answering. "Sometimes people see a title before they see the person." Lily thought about those words for several seconds before climbing down from her chair. She walked to the family photograph resting beside the window, smiling at the picture of her mother. "Mom always said fear makes people believe stories that are not true." Ethan lowered his eyes. He remembered those words perfectly. Lily turned back toward him with innocent certainty. "Are you afraid because Miss Victoria is rich?" Ethan let out a slow breath he had not realized he was holding. "Maybe a little." "Why?" she asked. "Because I do not know if someone like her could ever be happy living a life like ours." Lily smiled in the simple way only a child could. She already was. The words settled into the quiet workshop with unexpected power. Ethan replayed every memory from the past 2 weeks. Victoria laughing while painting pumpkins. Victoria feeding ducks beside the pond. Victoria helping the librarian organize books. None of those moments belonged to a billionaire. They belonged to a woman who had quietly rediscovered joy. At the same time, Victoria sat alone beneath the porch light of the bed and breakfast, holding the smooth, heart-shaped stone Lily had given her beside the pond. She remembered Ethan saying that success was having enough time to be home when Lily finished school. She remembered the retired teacher thanking him for leaving people richer than when he arrived. She remembered how nobody in Maple Creek had ever cared about her company, her wealth, or the headlines that followed her everywhere else. They had simply cared about her. A gentle breeze carried another shower of golden leaves across the empty street as Victoria closed her hand around the little stone and whispered softly into the autumn night, "I finally found the life I was searching for." Several blocks away, Ethan stood outside the workshop looking toward the distant porch where a single light still glowed. In that quiet moment, he understood something that changed everything. The greatest distance between them had never been measured by money, success, or social status. It had always been measured by the fear of believing they belonged in different worlds. The next morning dawned beneath a sky washed with soft shades of silver and pale blue as the first light settled gently across Maple Creek. Victoria stood beside the window of the bed and breakfast with a small suitcase resting near the door. Her phone had already begun ringing again, each call reminding her that thousands of employees, shareholders, and partners were waiting for decisions only she could make. She understood the responsibility. She had built Sterling Global Holdings one careful choice at a time, and she would never abandon the people who trusted her leadership. Even so, every instinct urged her to delay her departure for just one more hour. There was one goodbye she could not leave unfinished. She walked slowly toward Brooks Woodcraft while the crisp morning air carried the familiar scent of cedar, fresh coffee, and fallen maple leaves. When she reached the workshop, Ethan was standing at his workbench, carving the final details into a small piece of walnut beneath warm rays of sunlight shining through the old windows. He looked up, smiled quietly, and set his carving knife aside. "Good morning, Victoria," he said gently. It was the first time he had spoken her real name without hesitation. "Good morning," she answered with a soft smile that carried both gratitude and sadness. Neither of them rushed to speak again. The silence felt respectful, as though both understood this moment deserved patience. Victoria slowly walked through the workshop, letting her fingertips brush across handcrafted tables, polished bookshelves, and the rocking chair Ethan had restored only days before. "I came to thank you," she finally whispered. "These past weeks have been the happiest I can remember." Ethan folded his hands comfortably in front of him. "You never needed to thank us. You became part of this town the moment you started caring about the people in it." Victoria lowered her eyes. "I'm afraid I have to go back." Ethan nodded with calm understanding. "I thought you might." Before either of them could continue, Lily hurried through the doorway, carrying a tiny wooden box tied with a simple piece of blue ribbon. Her face glowed with excitement. "Daddy finished it last night," she announced proudly. Ethan smiled with quiet embarrassment. She was supposed to wait until I found the right words. Lily placed the little box into Victoria's hands anyway. Inside rested a beautifully polished walnut ring, simple in design, yet crafted with extraordinary care. Every smooth curve reflected hours of patient work, and the natural grain of the wood shimmered warmly beneath the morning light. Victoria looked up, her eyes already filling with tears. "It is beautiful," she whispered. Ethan stepped closer, his voice calm and steady. "It came from the oldest walnut tree on my family's land. My father always believed the strongest trees were the ones that stayed rooted through every season." Victoria gently lifted the ring, turning it slowly between her fingers. It was unlike any piece of jewelry she had ever owned, and somehow it felt more valuable than all the diamonds locked inside her apartment in New York. Ethan took one quiet breath before speaking again. "Victoria, I cannot promise you a life without difficult days. I cannot promise private islands, famous parties, or headlines celebrating every success. But I can promise that you will never have to wonder whether you are loved for who you are. I have never seen your fortune when I looked at you. I only saw the woman who laughed with Lily, helped neighbors without expecting praise, and found joy in ordinary mornings. Victoria felt another tear quietly slip down her cheek. Ethan gently held the little wooden ring between them. "I'm not asking to become part of your world," he said softly. "I'm asking whether you would let me build a world with you, one ordinary day at a time." The workshop became perfectly still. Outside, golden leaves drifted slowly across the front porch while the autumn breeze carried the scent of cedar through the open doorway. And in that quiet little room filled with honest work and quiet dignity, the most successful woman in America discovered that the greatest promise she had ever been offered was carved from wood instead of gold. Victoria looked down at the smooth walnut ring resting gently in her hands, and for several long seconds the entire workshop disappeared around her. The endless board meetings waiting in New York no longer seemed important. The luxury vehicles parked outside town faded from her thoughts. Even the headlines that had followed her for years lost their voice. All she could see was the quiet man standing before her, a father whose greatest treasure had never been measured by wealth, but by honesty, kindness, and the courage to love without expecting anything in return. A single tear slipped down her cheek before she smiled through the emotion. Carefully, she placed the handcrafted ring onto her finger. It fit as though it had always belonged there. Ethan never asked for an answer. He simply looked into her eyes with calm patience, believing that love should always be offered freely and never rushed. Victoria reached forward and gently took both of his hands. "Do you know why every engagement I ever accepted eventually ended?" she asked softly. Ethan slowly shook his head. "Because every promise began with everything I owned," she whispered. "Yours began with everything I am." The quiet words settled through the workshop like warm sunlight spreading across polished wood. Lily stood near the doorway, watching with hopeful eyes before her bright smile grew even wider. "Does that mean you said yes?" she asked with innocent excitement. Victoria laughed through joyful tears and nodded. "Yes, sweetheart, I believe I just did." Lily hurried forward and wrapped her arms around both of them, filling the little workshop with laughter that echoed against shelves, workbenches, and handcrafted furniture. Outside, one member of Victoria's security team happened to glance through the open doorway while speaking with her executive assistant. He quietly lowered his voice and smiled. "I think we could delay the flight," he said. "Some moments deserve a little more time." The assistant nodded, closing the folder she had been carrying. Nobody interrupted them. Nobody hurried inside. The stillness itself seemed worthy of respect. Later that afternoon, after Victoria finally contacted her board and explained that she would return the following morning, a traveler passing through Maple Creek recognized her near the woodworking shop. He quietly took a photograph as she and Ethan stood together beneath the brilliant maple trees, both smiling naturally, her simple walnut ring catching the warm autumn sunlight. By evening, the image appeared first on a local community news page, then on regional newspapers, before larger national outlets discovered the unexpected story. People across the country stared in surprise. There were no luxury yachts, no extravagant celebration, no diamond worth millions of dollars. The most successful businesswoman in America had accepted a handcrafted wooden ring made by a single father in a small town most people had never heard of. The conversation changed almost overnight. Television hosts stopped asking why successful women struggled to find love. Instead, they asked why genuine kindness had become so rare. Social media filled with messages celebrating humility, family, and simple acts of devotion. Many people admitted they had spent years admiring Victoria's achievements without ever realizing how lonely success could become. Others wrote that Ethan had reminded them true strength often speaks in the quietest voice. As evening settled over Maple Creek once again, Ethan, Victoria, and Lily sat together on the wooden steps outside the workshop watching the sunset paint the sky with gentle shades of amber and crimson. Victoria rested her hand beside Ethan's, quietly admiring the simple wooden ring. "For the first time in my life," she whispered, "I feel richer because someone loved me instead of everything around me." Ethan smiled toward the glowing horizon without saying another word. Sometimes the deepest promises did not need applause. They only needed two hearts willing to choose one another when the rest of the world had finally fallen silent. 1 year later, another October painted Maple Creek with brilliant shades of crimson, gold, and amber, and the little town seemed even warmer than Victoria remembered from the day she first arrived, carrying nothing more than a small suitcase and a tired heart. Brooks Woodcraft had quietly become one of the most admired handcrafted furniture shops in the region, not because of expensive advertising or celebrity endorsements, but because every table, rocking chair, bookshelf, and wooden toy reflected the same values Ethan had always lived by. People traveled from neighboring states to place custom orders, often waiting several months because Ethan refused to rush work that deserved patience. Above the workshop entrance, a small wooden plaque now read, "Built with care, meant to last." Victoria smiled every time she passed beneath it because she believed those words described their family as much as the furniture inside. Although she remained the chief executive officer of Sterling Global Holdings, she had transformed the way she lived and led. She divided her time between New York and Maple Creek, refusing to let success steal the ordinary moments she had almost lost forever. Board meetings ended earlier. Weekends belonged to family. Her executives noticed something unexpected. As Victoria became happier, she also became wiser. She invested more in people than appearances, launched apprenticeship programs for skilled trades, funded scholarships for rural students, and quietly restored libraries, community centers, and small businesses without placing her own name on every project. Whenever reporters praised her generosity, she simply smiled and replied, "The best ideas usually begin in the smallest places." Lily had grown another inch taller and still filled every room with cheerful laughter. She proudly introduced Victoria as her mother long before. Any official document made it true, and Victoria treasured those simple words more than every award she had ever received. The little wooden birdhouse Lily had painted still rested on a shelf inside the workshop, now home to a family of bluebirds that returned every spring. The smooth, heart-shaped stone from Miller Pond remained on Victoria's desk beside her office window in New York, quietly reminding her that strength and tenderness could live together. On a beautiful Saturday afternoon, family, friends, and neighbors gathered beneath towering maple trees for a simple outdoor wedding celebration. There were no grand stages, famous entertainers, or extravagant displays. Long handcrafted wooden tables filled with homemade pies, fresh flowers, warm bread, and apple cider stretched across the town square. Children laughed as they chased colorful leaves across the grass while an old bluegrass band played familiar melodies beneath the gazebo. The ceremony reflected everything Ethan and Victoria had come to value. Honest promises, quiet joy, grateful hearts. As they stood together beneath the golden autumn sky, Ethan gently held Victoria's hands, the walnut ring still resting gracefully on her finger. The pastor smiled warmly before saying, "Some people spend their lives searching for extraordinary love, only to discover that the truest love is built through ordinary kindness shared every single day." A peaceful silence followed before gentle applause filled the crisp afternoon air. Victoria looked into Ethan's calm eyes and realized he had never tried to rescue a billionaire or impress a successful businesswoman. He had simply welcomed a lonely traveler with kindness when she needed it most. Ethan had never seen her fortune before he saw her heart, and that single difference had changed both of their lives forever. As the sun slowly disappeared behind the maple trees, casting warm light across the workshop, the town, and the family now standing together, one quiet truth remained. Wealth may build remarkable buildings, success may earn lasting respect, and achievement may change the world, but only love offered with humility, dignity, grace, and unwavering kindness can truly become the place another heart calls home.